Darkness presses in on every side. Somewhere ahead, three sisters sleep among a floor littered with the shapes of men who came before him, some crouched, some frozen mid-stride, all of them stone. Perseus does not look at them directly, he cannot. He carries a shield polished to a mirror's shine, tilted just so, and inside its curved bronze surface, a second world moves where the real one cannot be trusted. Serpents coil and hiss in that reflection, hundreds of them, growing from a woman's scalp, like something the earth itself regrets having made. One wrong glance ends everything. One flicker of the eyes toward the true, waking creature instead of her mirrored ghost, and he becomes one more statue in her collection, a warning for the next fool who wanders this far. Her sisters stir but do not wake. The one he has come for lies closest to him, breathing slow, her serpents shifting faintly in sleep, like grass in a wind he cannot feel. He raises the curved blade a god once placed in his hand. Her eyes begin to open. He strikes. But how does a young man with no army, no kingdom, and no experience become the man capable of killing one of the most feared creatures Greek mythology ever produced? To understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a king who feared his own bloodline, a prophecy no wall could keep out, and a chest cast into the sea carrying a mother and a son the gods had not finished with yet. Welcome to Deep History Origins. This is the complete story of Perseus. Long before any sword touched Medusa's throat, there was a king who could not stop looking over his own shoulder. Acrisius ruled the city of Argos, a man who had fought hard for his throne and intended to die on it, decades from now, an old man surrounded by heirs of his own choosing. He had one child, a daughter named Danaë, and no son at all, a gap in his household that gnawed at him more than any rival army ever could. Desperate for an answer the gods alone could give him, Acrisius travelled to the oracle at Delphi and asked what future awaited his line. The answer he received was not the one he wanted. He would never have a son, the oracle told him. Instead, his daughter would bear a child, a grandson, and that grandson would one day kill him. A prophecy like that does not frighten a king the way a rival army does. An army can be met on a field, negotiated with, bought off, or outlasted behind strong walls. A prophecy cannot. It does not march toward you on a schedule you can prepare for. It simply waits, patient as stone, for the moment you least expect it. Acrisius did what frightened men in positions of absolute power have always done. He tried to control the uncontrollable. If no child could be born to Danaë, then no grandson could ever grow old enough to lift a sword against him. He had a chamber built beneath the palace, walled in bronze, sealed against every visitor, every suitor, every possibility of a future he refused to accept. His daughter would live there, guarded, untouched, and the prophecy, he told himself, would simply starve for lack of the child it required. He had not accounted for Zeus. The king of the gods took little interest in mortal locks and bronze walls when a woman caught his attention, and Danaë, alone in her sealed chamber, drew exactly that kind of attention. The old stories describe his approach as something closer to weather than to a visitor, a fall of golden light pouring down through whatever gap the chamber's builders had failed to seal completely, filling the room and leaving Danaë, in time, carrying a child that no mortal father had fathered. Ancient storytellers were careful, when they told this part of the myth, to keep the moment distant and strange rather than explicit. Divine encounters in these stories were rarely described as ordinary human ones, and the emphasis fell less on the act itself than on its consequence. A boy was coming. The prophecy, locked away in bronze and stone, had found its way through anyway. When the child was finally born, Danaë named him Perseus, and for a while she managed to keep both the birth and the boy's cries hidden from her father within the sealed chamber's walls. It could not last. A palace has too many ears, and eventually one of them carried the sound of an infant to Acrisius himself. He did not simply grow angry, he grew afraid, in a deeper, colder way than before, because the thing he had built walls specifically to prevent had happened anyway, inside those very walls, while he slept 2 floors above it. If bronze and stone could not stop the gods, nothing built by human hands ever would. The prophecy was no longer a distant possibility hovering somewhere in his future. It was downstairs, crying for its mother, and it had his own daughter's eyes. Acrisius could not bring himself to kill his own daughter and her infant son outright. Whether from lingering love, from fear of the gods' anger at a king who murdered a woman Zeus himself had visited, or simply from the particular cowardice of men who prefer their cruelty at a distance, he chose a method that let him avoid watching the consequence unfold. He ordered a large wooden chest built, sturdy enough to float, sealed tightly enough to keep the sea from pouring straight in, and had Danaë and the infant Perseus placed inside it together. Then he had the chest carried to the shore and set adrift on the open water, leaving their fate to the sea rather than to his own hand. Inside, there would have been no light beyond whatever seams let it through, no sound but water against wood, and Danaë's own voice, murmuring to a child too young to understand why the world had suddenly narrowed to a few dark feet of space. The sea does not negotiate with the desperate. It rises and falls according to its own indifferent rhythm, and a wooden box thrown onto its surface is, to the water, nothing more than driftwood with a heartbeat inside it. Danaë held her son through storms she had no way to predict, and calm stretches that must have felt, in their own way, just as frightening, since calm water gave her nothing to do but wait. Ancient tradition credits her with prayers offered to Zeus during that crossing, asking the god who had fathered her child to now protect him, since he had done nothing yet to intervene on their behalf, beyond the act that had placed them in this chest to begin with. Eventually, after days adrift that no source bothers to count precisely, the current carried them to the shores of a small island called Seriphos. A fisherman working the waters that morning, a man named Dictys, spotted the chest tangled in his nets and hauled it in expecting driftwood, or, at best, a stroke of ordinary luck. What he found instead was a woman and an infant, salt-crusted and exhausted but alive, delivered to his particular stretch of coastline by a sea that could just as easily have swallowed them both without comment. Dictys took them in. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely decent man, brother to the island's king but living a far humbler life himself, and he raised Perseus alongside his own household as the boy grew from an infant rescued from the water into a young man who had no idea, for most of his childhood, exactly how strange his own arrival on that shore had actually been. Perseus grew up strong and capable in the way island life demanded, comfortable on boats, quick with a blade when the situation called for one, fiercely protective of the mother who had held on to him through a crossing neither of them should have survived. He did not know about the oracle at Delphi, or the bronze chamber, or the grandfather back in Argos who still, somewhere, lived in quiet dread of a grandson he assumed the sea had already claimed. Perseus knew only Seriphos, only Dictys' kindness, and only Danaë, whom he loved with the particular fierceness of a son who understands, without being told the details, that his mother has survived something enormous to bring him this far. Seriphos had a king of its own, and he was nothing like his brother Dictys. Polydectes ruled the island with an eye constantly measuring what he wanted against what stood in his way, and what he wanted, as Perseus grew from boy to young man, increasingly centered on Danaë herself. She refused him. Whatever her reasons, grief for the life stolen from her in Argos, simple lack of interest, or a clear-eyed read of exactly what kind of man Polydectes actually was, Danaë made her rejection plain, and a king unused to hearing the word no from anyone found himself hearing it, repeatedly, from a woman with no army and no throne behind her. What stood most visibly between Polydectes and what he wanted was Perseus. A grown son, strong, watchful, and fiercely loyal to his mother, made any attempt at coercion considerably more dangerous than the king would have liked. Killing Perseus outright, though, carried its own risks. Dictys held real affection for the young man. The island's people had watched him grow up among them, and an obviously murdered rival would raise exactly the kind of questions Polydectes preferred to avoid. So the king chose subtlety instead of force. He announced a grand feast, and at that feast he declared that every guest would be expected to bring him a gift, ideally a fine horse, the traditional offering among men of standing, the kind of gift that announced a guest's wealth and loyalty in a single gesture. It was a request perfectly calibrated to expose Perseus, who had no horse, no fortune, and no way to produce, either on short notice. Pride did the rest of the king's work for him, standing among guests who had each promised their horses, feeling the weight of his own empty hands and, perhaps, sensing exactly the trap being laid around him. Perseus made a declaration far larger than the situation required. He would not embarrass himself with excuses. He would instead bring the king something no other guest at that feast could ever hope to offer: the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned living men to stone. The hall went quiet. Polydectes, more delighted than he let show, accepted the offer immediately and made certain every witness in the room heard Perseus bind himself to it. As far as the king was concerned, the matter was already settled. No man had ever hunted a Gorgon and returned to tell of it. Perseus had, in his own moment of wounded pride, handed Polydectes exactly what he wanted, without the king ever needing to lift a finger himself. A guaranteed absence, likely permanent, and no blood on his own hands to answer for. Who was Medusa? To understand what Perseus had actually promised to bring back, we need to understand what, and who, Medusa truly was, because the ancient tradition surrounding her is neither simple nor entirely consistent across the sources that survive. Medusa belonged to a trio of sisters known as the Gorgons, monstrous figures born, in most accounts, to ancient sea deities from a generation older than the Olympian gods themselves. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, shared her terrible power, a gaze capable of turning living flesh to stone in an instant, and shared, too, her fearsome appearance, serpents in place of hair, and in some tellings, wings of bronze, tusks like a boar's, hands of brass. What set Medusa apart from her sisters was a single crucial detail. Stheno and Euryale were immortal. Medusa, alone among the three, could die. That single distinction is the reason the entire myth exists at all. A hero sent to kill an immortal creature returns with nothing but a story of failure. A hero sent after the one Gorgon capable of actually dying has, at least in principle, a mission that can succeed. Later tradition, developing centuries after the earliest versions of this story took shape, added a different layer to Medusa's origin, one that ancient sources themselves do not present with a single voice. In this later telling, Medusa had not always been a monster at all. She had once been a beautiful young woman, a priestess in the service of Athena, and her transformation came not as a birthright, but as a punishment, following an encounter with Poseidon inside Athena's own temple. Whether that encounter was framed by ancient storytellers as violation or as offense against the goddess's sanctuary varied, depending on who was telling the tale and when, and different sources handle the moral weight of the story quite differently. What most versions of this later tradition agree on is the outcome. Athena's fury fell not on Poseidon, but on Medusa herself, and her hair was transformed into serpents, her gaze into a weapon that would strike down any man who dared look at her directly. We should be honest about something here. These are not two competing historical accounts waiting for a scholar to settle which one is factually correct. They are two different literary traditions, composed generations apart, reflecting different concerns and different storytellers' choices about what kind of figure Medusa was meant to be. The earlier tradition presents her simply as one of three monstrous sisters, born that way, part of an older, stranger generation of divine beings. The later tradition reframes her as someone wronged, transformed by punishment rather than birth. Both versions exist. Both have shaped how later ages understood her. And that tension, between monster and victim, between something simply born dangerous and something made dangerous by injustice, sits at the very center of why her story has outlasted so many others from the same mythology. Was Medusa always a monster, or did something happen to make her one? The question does not resolve easily, and it should not. It is worth carrying forward, unanswered, into the rest of this story. The gods choose Perseus. Whatever Medusa's true origin, one fact remained unavoidable for the young man who had just promised to bring back her head. No living person knew, with any certainty, where the Gorgons could actually be found. Perseus had no ship prepared for such a voyage. no army capable of forcing information out of anyone who might know, and no weapon remotely capable of striking down a creature whose gaze alone had already claimed countless victims. Pride had committed him to an impossible task, and pride alone would not get him a single step closer to completing it. It was here that the gods themselves stepped into the story, and their involvement tells us something important about how this particular myth understands heroism. Perseus does not win his fight with Medusa through raw strength or personal invincibility. He wins because he receives help, because he listens to that help, and because he uses tools built for outsmarting an enemy rather than simply overpowering one. Athena appeared to him first. The goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare had her own reasons for taking an interest in Medusa's fate, reasons bound up in the older tradition of the priestess wronged inside her temple, and whatever her exact motivation, she chose to guide Perseus rather than complete the task herself. She gave him the bronze shield polished to mirror brightness, explaining the single rule that would keep him alive in the Gorgon's lair. Never look at Medusa directly, only at her reflection, moving and monstrous but harmless in polished metal instead of open air. Hermes came next, swift and practical as always, bringing a curved sword forged specifically for this purpose, a blade capable of cutting through scales and serpents alike, where an ordinary weapon might simply fail against a creature built from something other than common flesh. Neither god, though, could tell Perseus exactly where to find the Gorgons. That knowledge belonged to a stranger set of beings entirely, and reaching them required tools Perseus did not yet possess. The nymphs, guided by Hermes toward a hidden dwelling far from any mortal road, provided the rest of what he needed. Winged sandals, light enough to carry him across seas and mountains no ordinary traveler could cross on foot. A magical pouch, called in some tellings a kibisis, woven specifically to hold Medusa's severed head safely afterward, since even in death, her gaze retained its terrible power, and an ordinary sack would offer no protection at all. And finally, the cap of invisibility, borrowed from Hades himself, capable of hiding its wearer from any eye, mortal or divine, for as long as he needed to remain unseen. Each gift solved a different piece of an otherwise impossible puzzle. The shield solved the problem of looking without dying. The sword solved the problem of striking through something no ordinary blade could cut. The sandals solved the problem of reaching a place no map could show him. The pouch solved the problem of carrying his prize home without it killing everyone he passed along the way. The cap solved the problem of surviving Medusa's sisters once her death woke them from sleep. Perseus was not becoming a stronger man through any of this. He was becoming a better equipped one, and the myth is careful to make that distinction. Every advantage came from somewhere else, from goddess, god, and nymph alike, and the hero's real skill lay in accepting help without letting pride refuse it, then using every piece of it exactly as instructed. One obstacle remained before any of those gifts could be put to use. Only one set of beings in the entire world knew the location of the Gorgon's lair, and they had no interest whatsoever in sharing that information freely. The Grey were three sisters, grey-haired since birth according to the old tradition, ancient even by the standards of a mythology already full of ancient things. Between the three of them, they shared a single eye and a single tooth, passing each back and forth as needed, taking turns seeing the world through the one working eye, while the other two sisters waited in patient, sightless darkness. Perseus found them in a bleak, twilight place, far from any road a mortal traveller would normally walk, and he understood almost immediately that reasoning with them would accomplish nothing. The Grey had no reason to help a stranger locate the very Gorgons they were sworn, by old ties of kinship, to protect from exactly this kind of hunter. So Perseus did something considerably less noble than the rest of his quest might suggest, and the old sources report it without much apology. He waited for the moment the eye passed between two of the sisters' hands, caught it in the brief instant it belonged to neither of them, and held it just out of reach. Blind and suddenly powerless, the sisters had no choice left but to bargain. Perseus offered a simple trade, the location of the Gorgons, in exchange for the return of their eye, and the Grey, understanding they had no better option available to them, finally told him what he needed to know. The journey that followed carried him further from anything resembling familiar ground. The landscape itself seemed to change character the closer he came to his destination, growing barren and strange, the ordinary sounds of birds and wind giving way to a silence that felt deliberate rather than simply empty. Whatever lived out here had long since driven away anything that might have made noise in protest. Eventually, cresting a final rise, Perseus saw it, a cave mouth, dark against pale stone, and scattered across the ground before it, half hidden in scrub and shadow, the unmistakable shapes of men who had come this way before him and never left. Some knelt, some had their arms raised as if still trying to shield their faces from a sight that had already finished its work before they could complete the gesture. He did not look at them for long. He could not look at what waited beyond them at all. Not directly, not yet. Inside, the cave held the kind of silence that presses against the ears rather than simply existing around them. Perseus moved slowly, the polished shield angled carefully in front of him, watching the world unfold backward and reversed in its bronze surface, rather than trust his own eyes for even a moment. The Gorgons slept in a loose cluster near the cave's deeper chambers, their breathing slow and even, serpents shifting faintly across 3 scalps, in a way that might, from a safe enough distance, have almost looked peaceful. Stheno and Euryale lay closest to the entrance. Medusa lay beyond them, and even asleep, even reduced to a reflection caught sideways in tilted bronze. Something about her stillness carried more weight than her sisters did. Perseus kept his eyes fixed on the mirrored image and nothing else. Athena's voice, according to the old tellings, stayed with him in that final approach, steady and precise, guiding his angle, his footing, the careful placement of each step, across a floor he could not risk watching directly. He drew close enough to strike. He raised the curved sword Hermes had given him. Medusa's eyes began to open. Whether she sensed him through some instinct sharpened by centuries of hunters who had come before him, or whether it was simple chance that her sleep ended at that exact moment, the old sources do not agree, and do not much care to settle the question. What matters is what happened next. Perseus, watching only her reflected image, brought the blade down and across in a single motion, and Medusa's head separated from her body before her eyes had fully focused on the world around her. What followed was stranger than the killing itself. From the wound, according to the old accounts, 2 beings emerged fully formed, the winged horse Pegasus and a warrior named Chrysaor, both said to have been fathered by Poseidon during that same temple encounter years before, held inside her until this final moment released them into the world. It is one of the myth's stranger images, life springing directly from violent death, and ancient storytellers offered it without much explanation, beyond the simple fact that this was what happened. Medusa's blood carried power even now that she herself was gone. Certain traditions describe drops of it falling across the surrounding desert and transforming instantly into venomous serpents that would trouble travelers in that region for generations afterward. Other tellings assign her blood a stranger duality entirely, blood drawn from one side of her body capable of killing instantly, blood from the other side capable of raising the dead. Whatever the precise details, the myth is consistent on one point. Nothing about Medusa lost its power simply because she had. Perseus had no time to reflect on any of it. Stheno and Euryale, woken by their sister's death, rose with a fury the myth describes as immediate and absolute, and immortal as they were, no blade Perseus carried could have ended either of them the way he had ended Medusa. He had one advantage left, and he used it without hesitation. The cap of invisibility settled over him, and the 2 remaining Gorgons tore through empty air, hunting a scent and a sound they could no longer locate, while Perseus, unseen, slipped past them and out into open sky on his borrowed winged sandals, Medusa's head already sealed safely inside the kibyssus at his side. He had done what no living man had ever managed. He had also, without quite realizing it yet, taken possession of a weapon more dangerous than anything he had carried into that cave. The flight home should have been simple after everything Perseus had already survived. It was not. Winged sandals carried him back across seas and mountains, retracing a route that had taken considerable effort to travel in the opposite direction. And somewhere along that return journey, Passing over the coast of a kingdom called Ethiopia, Perseus saw something that made him alter his course entirely. A young woman stood chained to a rock at the water's edge, waves breaking against the stone beneath her feet, left utterly alone on a shoreline with no guard, no rescuer, no visible reason for her situation at all beyond the chains themselves. Her name, Perseus would soon learn, was Andromeda, and the story behind her chains began not with any fault of her own, but with her mother's pride. Queen Cassiopeia, ruling alongside her husband Cepheus, had made the mistake of boasting that her daughter's beauty surpassed that of the Nereids, the sea nymphs who served Poseidon directly. It was precisely the kind of claim the gods of this mythology could never simply let pass. Poseidon, offended on behalf of the nymphs under his protection, sent a sea monster called Cetus to ravage the Ethiopian coastline. And when Cepheus sought guidance on how to end the devastation, the answer he received placed the burden not on the queen whose pride had caused it, but on the daughter who had done nothing at all. Only the sacrifice of Andromeda, chained and offered to the monster, would satisfy the god's anger. Perseus did not know any of this yet when he first saw her from above. He knew only that a young woman had been left to die alone on a rock, and something in that image, perhaps memory of his own mother, held captive by a king's cruelty, perhaps simple immediate outrage at the sight itself, pulled him down out of the sky toward her. This is worth pausing on, because it marks something different from everything that came before it in his story. Perseus had not sought Medusa out of choice. Pride, and the trap Polydectes had set around that pride, had pushed him into that fight. Andromeda's rock was different. Nothing required him to land there. No king, no prophecy, no wounded pride demanded it of him. He chose this battle entirely on his own, and that choice marks the moment Perseus stops being simply a young man completing an assigned task and starts becoming something closer to what later ages would recognize as a hero acting on his own conviction. Landing near enough to speak with her, Perseus learned quickly what awaited Andromeda if no one intervened. Cetus was coming, drawn by the very sacrifice arranged to appease it, and nothing on that shoreline offered her any real chance of escape or defense. He did not hesitate long. Whatever calculation he made, weighing the exhaustion of everything he had already survived against the danger still ahead of him, it resolved quickly in favor of the fight. When Cetus finally rose from the water, vast and terrible in the way sea monsters of this mythology always are, Perseus met it directly, rather than retreating to safety with the prize he already carried. The battle that followed drew on every advantage the gods had given him. The winged sandals let him strike from angles no grounded fighter could manage, sweeping in and away again before the creature's bulk could fully turn to meet him. Some versions of the story describe him using Medusa's severed head itself in this fight, tilting the kibisis open just enough to catch Cetus's attention and turn a portion of the monster to stone before finishing the work with his blade. Other tellings keep the head sealed throughout and credit the victory to sword and speed alone. Either way, the outcome holds steady across the tradition. Cetus fell, Andromeda lived. Freed from her chains, Andromeda's gratitude quickly deepened into something more, and Cepheus, relieved beyond measure to have his daughter returned to him alive, offered her hand in marriage to the young man who had saved her. It seemed, for a moment, like the story's natural and uncomplicated conclusion. It was not that simple. Andromeda had already been promised, before any of this began, to a man named Phineus, her uncle, in most versions of the tradition, who had made no move to save her from the rock himself, but who now had every intention of claiming her regardless. When Perseus and Andromeda's wedding proceeded despite that earlier promise, Phineus arrived with armed followers of his own, determined to take by force what he believed still belonged to him by right. Perseus found himself surrounded, badly outnumbered in a hall never built to withstand a small war breaking out inside it. He understood quickly that no amount of individual skill would let him fight his way clear of so many opponents at once. So he reached instead for the weapon he had carried, sealed and largely unused, since walking out of Medusa's cave. He warned those loyal to him to look away, opened the kibisis, and lifted the severed head into the light of the hall. One by one, Phineus's men went still, Stone spread through the room the way it had once spread through the ground outside Medusa's own lair, and by the time it was finished, Phineus himself knelt among the frozen shapes of his own followers, begging for a mercy Perseus, after everything, chose not to grant him. It marks a real turning point in how the myth presents its hero. The young man who had once needed a goddess's careful guidance just to survive a sleeping monster now stood in a mortal king's hall, deciding the fate of an entire kingdom's ambitions with a weapon he alone controlled. Perseus was no longer simply the boy who had gone after Medusa. He had become someone capable of reshaping the fortunes of kings. With Andromeda now his wife, Perseus turned his winged sandals back towards Seriphos, the island where his entire story had actually begun. He expected, reasonably enough, to find his mother waiting for him there, safe under Dictys' protection, exactly as he had left her. What he found instead was considerably darker. Polydectes had not simply waited patiently across the many months of Perseus's absence, quietly assuming his rival dead and gone for good. He had continued pressing his unwanted attentions on Danaë the entire time, growing bolder as the odds of Perseus ever returning seemed to shrink with each passing season. Danaë and Dictys had eventually been forced to take shelter at a sacred altar, the one place on the island where even a king's ambitions could not easily follow them, living under a kind of desperate, uneasy sanctuary, while they waited for a return neither of them could be certain would ever actually come. Perseus arrived to find the court gathered for one of Polydectes' feasts, the king himself almost certainly assuming by this point that the boy who had once made an impossible boast had simply died somewhere far from home, exactly as intended. Perseus walked into that hall and found Polydectes seated among followers who had, by all accounts, spent considerable time mocking the very idea that Medusa's head would ever actually materialize. Perseus did not argue with any of them. He simply lifted the kibisis, and this time he did not warn the room to look away first. What Polydectes and his court found waiting for them was not the empty boast they had been laughing about for months. It was Medusa's head itself, and within moments the king who had schemed so carefully to be rid of Perseus without ever risking his own hands, sat frozen at the center of his own hall, turned to stone alongside the followers who had mocked the quest with him. With Polydectes gone, the island needed a new ruler, and Perseus, who had never wanted a throne on Seriphos to begin with, saw the position pass instead to Dictys, the fisherman who had pulled a sealed chest from the sea years earlier, and asked for nothing in return beyond the chance to raise the family he found inside it. It was, in its own quiet way, the truest payoff the story could offer. The man who had shown genuine kindness with no expectation of reward became king. Danaë, after years spent fleeing one man's fear and then defending herself against another man's ambition, was finally fully safe. With his mother secure and his impossible task behind him, Perseus turned his attention, at last, toward the place where his entire story had truly started. Not Seriphos, where he had grown up, but Argos, the kingdom his grandfather Acrisius still ruled, still haunted by a prophecy he had spent decades trying to outrun. Word of Perseus's return travelled ahead of him, as word of a man who had slain Medusa inevitably would, and Acrisius, hearing that his grandson was not only alive, but approaching Argos itself, felt the old fear rise back up, exactly as sharp as it had been the night he first heard an infant crying in a chamber, meant to be sealed against exactly this possibility. Decades of careful avoidance had done nothing, in the end, to change what the oracle had told him all those years before. The grandson he had cast into the sea was coming home a hero, and the prophecy that had never actually gone anywhere was coming with him. Acrisius fled the city rather than face what he had spent his whole reign trying to prevent. Whether he genuinely believed flight could still save him, or whether some older, wearier part of him simply could not bear to watch the moment arrive in person, the sources do not say for certain. What they agree on is this: a king who had built bronze chambers and sealed wooden chests against a single grandson's fate found, in the end, that there was nowhere left on earth quite far enough away to actually escape it. Greek mythology treats fate differently than many later storytelling traditions do. Heroes in these old stories rarely defeat destiny outright through cleverness or strength. More often, Their choices simply become the means through which fate finds its way to exactly the outcome it always intended. Acrisius spent a lifetime trying to prevent his grandson's existence, and that very attempt, the chest, the sea, the years of exile on Seriphos, created the hero capable of fulfilling the prophecy far more completely than a grandson raised safely in Argos ever could have. The end, when it came, arrived through no plan of Perseus's own making. Some time after Acrisius had fled Argos, word reached Perseus that funeral games were being held in a distant city, athletic competitions of the kind common across the Greek world, drawing competitors and spectators from many different kingdoms. Perseus, still young, still strong, still very much a man who enjoyed the kind of contest that let him test his own skill honestly, travelled there to compete. Acrisius, it turned out, was among the spectators that day, having sought refuge in that same distant city, though the sources differ on whether Perseus knew his grandfather was present among the crowd. Most versions suggest he did not. During the discus event, Perseus threw with the same strength that had carried him through everything else in his story, through Medusa's cave, through the battle with Cetus, through the hall where Phineus's men had once surrounded him. The discus went wide of its intended course, carried by a gust of wind or simple miscalculation, and struck an elderly spectator standing among the crowd. That spectator was Acrisius. He died from the blow. The prophecy that had shaped every major turn of this entire story, the sealed chamber, the chest cast into the sea, decades of a king's careful, fearful exile from his own fate, reached its conclusion not through any deliberate act of vengeance, not through a confrontation Perseus had sought or even wanted, but through a stray discus thrown at an athletic contest neither man had arranged with the other in mind. This is worth sitting with, because it is one of the most important ideas the entire myth has to offer. Perseus never set out to kill his grandfather. He never even sought him out with violence in mind. The prophecy fulfilled itself anyway, through an accident so ordinary that it could have happened to any two strangers standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Greek storytellers understood something about fate that later, more individualistic traditions often forget. That you can spend an entire lifetime running from a destiny, structure every decision around avoiding it, and still find that the very act of running was simply fate's chosen route to where it always intended to arrive. Perseus grieved for a grandfather he had barely known, a man whose fear had shaped the entire shape of his own life, without either of them ever truly meeting as anything other than strangers connected by an old, cold prophecy. Unwilling, afterward, to claim the throne of Argos, through a death that felt more like tragedy than triumph, Perseus arranged an exchange of kingdoms with a neighbouring ruler, trading his claim on Argos for rule over Tiryns instead, leaving the city his grandfather had feared to lose to someone whose hands, at least, were not connected to that particular grief. What became of Perseus after the prophecy finally closed itself around him tells us as much about how the Greeks understood heroism as anything from the earlier, more dramatic chapters of his story. He ruled with Andromeda at his side for the rest of his life, and their marriage produced a line of descendants who would go on to matter enormously to later Greek mythology and history alike. Their children and grandchildren became known as the Perseids, a dynasty whose bloodline later storytellers traced forward across generations, eventually connecting it, in some traditions, all the way to Heracles himself, meaning the man who killed Medusa stood, in the mythological imagination of later Greeks, as an ancestor to their single most famous hero of all. The city of Mycenae, according to several traditions, owed its founding to Perseus as well, meaning his legacy extended beyond his own children into the physical shape of the Greek world itself, into cities whose ruins still stand today. Later ages, reaching further still, placed Perseus among the stars, a constellation bearing his name, positioned near Andromeda's own, the two of them fixed together in the night sky, in a kind of permanent, quiet echo of the rock where he had first found her chained. Medusa's story did not end with her death either. Her severed head eventually passed into Athena's own keeping, according to most traditions, mounted upon the goddess's shield or breastplate, the aegis, where it continued serving exactly the same purpose it always had, turning the goddess's enemies to stone, protecting, rather than merely destroying, a fitting final home for a figure whose entire myth had always balanced uneasily between monster and victim, weapon and warning. So we return to the question this story asked from its very beginning. Was Perseus a hero because he was simply stronger than everyone and everything he faced? The evidence says no, consistently and clearly. He survived the Grey Eye through cleverness rather than force. He survived Medusa through a goddess's careful guidance and a shield built for looking away rather than looking directly at danger. He survived Phineus's ambush through a weapon he had not made and could not have made himself. What Perseus actually possessed, in the end, was a combination far more interesting than raw strength alone: courage enough to make an impossible promise, humility enough to accept help from those wiser and more powerful than himself, and the good fortune, whether we call it fate or simply timing, to be standing in exactly the right place when the gods decided a hero was needed. Perseus began as an infant sealed inside a chest and thrown into open water by a grandfather, too frightened to face him directly. He became a warrior capable of ending a Gorgon's life with a single well-guided strike. He rescued a stranger, chained to a rock, for no reason beyond his own sense of what was right. He faced down a king's private army with nothing but a severed head and the nerve to use it, and still, after every single one of those triumphs, he could not fully escape the one thing that had shaped his entire existence from before he ever drew his first breath. Perseus did not defeat fate. He became the hero fate had already written. If you want to hear the complete stories behind the greatest legends of the ancient world, subscribe to Deep History Origins.